Hello and welcome to the Jordan Peterson podcast on Oil Money Plus Network. Look it up. We actually are funded by scions of the oil and gas industry. It's not a bloody joke. Today I'm joined again with the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada and, God willing, inshallah, the next Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Poilievre. How is that pronounced?
The easiest way for an Anglo to say it is Poilievre.
Now, I'm curious, you're obviously a very wise political leader.
Yeah, thank you.
Not a free market CEO or entrepreneur or anything like that. It should be better, but according to your own ideology, but you're not, but you're a politician instead. But I wanted to ask, when did you wake up to the destructive nature of wokeness in the way that it degrades our society and makes us as a country weak, our children stupid, our men emasculated, and our women into witches, Marxist witches?
Well, it was kind of a slow process. You're kind of groggy at first, and you're slowly starting to piece things together, right. Your eyes opening.
Like when you wake up in the morning.
Exactly like that. But I think the moment where my eyes really snapped open, where I started to understand what was going on, was when I received a book by Milton Friedman called Freedom and Capitalism. And then, reading that, I just realized that because wokeism is the problem, the solution is to go back to sleep. And not enough people are doing that. You need to close your eyes to academia, to science, studying history, to even listening to the experiences of people different from you, because all of these things are infested with wokeness.
Right.
The fact checkers, the universities, all of it. It's woke, it's woke, it's woke. So I close my eyes, and that's how I go through life. I go through life asleep.
Thank you so much for that, Pierre. I wish more people were like you. When I woke up to the perils of wokeness, the way that it's damaging our families and our institutions, I immediately worked to shut my eyes and put on weighted eyelid closers that would keep my eyes shut, that even if I stir, I could always stay as asleep as possible. And well, just think about what happens to these poor kids who they go to school and people tell them, sorry, they say being a boy is bad. They say you should never vote for a conservative. And it's, what do you bloody expect to happen?
When people think that going through your life with your eyes closed would be difficult, or cars will crash into you, or, other things like that. But that hasn't been my experience at all. I've heard a few people honk when I cross the street or swerve, crash into other people, but nobody's hit me yet. And, I really credit my ability to walk through life with my eyes closed to Jesus Christ. I think Jesus Christ will watch over us as we're going through life with these eyelid weights.
In Psalm 33:8, I'm reminded, you can rest without worry or fear all night, because while you rest, God is watching over you. That's exactly what you're talking about. And
Yep.
I mean this as the deepest possible compliment, but I think the only way that someone could ever vote for you is if their eyes were absolutely shut to your true nature and they were deeply, deeply asleep.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. That is one of the truest, most beautiful things anyone's ever said.
You're the opposite of woke, sir. You were absolutely bloody asleep, and it's beautiful to see. I can't thank you enough and the Canadian people enough for polling in a region that implies they're going to vote you in. Hey, what's up, neighborinos, and welcome to the Seriously Wrong podcast, you beautiful, beautiful geniuses. Here, take a seat on the big, soft, luxurious couch
that people sit on when they're listening to us. If you can imagine, it's not a podcast. It's more like you come into a big room and the two of us are standing there and we just talk.
It's just one big giant couch that fills the entire room.
And you sit on it and
listen to the show. And it's very soft and people make friends there, lifelong friends. It's a great couch.
Yeah, and today we're continuing our discussion on the Jordan Peterson, Pierre Poilievre interview that we talked about last week, or as we call him, I've seen some people call him Stinky PP, PP, Pierre Poilievre.
It is funny that his initials are PP.
Yeah,
it's
really
nice
funny
to notice.
We call him Freaky Pierre because he freaks us out. He's a creep. And, he's a peeping Tom type.
Yeah, he wants to collect everybody's IDs in order for them to look at porn. So
that's true. It's a policy. Yeah. He supports this idea of porn sites getting ID from everyone to protect children is his claim. But we know his secret desire is to compare the ID and what videos people watched so he can get his sick jollies from that. Because he imagines an expanding role of government, a big, huge government that watches everything you do, including the specific timestamps, how far in the video you got, if you skipped around, that kind of stuff on porn sites.
How is he going to crack down on crime? But yeah, we finished off the last episode playing a little bit from Jordan Peterson's first interview with Pierre.
Pre-media training, where you can see a lot more of who he truly is before he gets... Because basically they took this nerd. They took this backbench conservative nerd. They made him leader, and they were like, this isn't going to work, but we can rebuild him. We have the technology. And they brought him to an underground bunker, and they opened him up like a car, and they swapped out all the parts, and they taught him to talk differently and act differently. They put him on HGH or testosterone. They gave him buccal fat reductions.
Yeah, and we played a little bit. We heard how he was in high school, whether he was popular and that kind of stuff. But yeah, I just wanted to play a little bit more of 2 years ago, Pierre.
I'm here simply restoring what already belonged to Canadians by virtue of their 800-year inheritance of English liberties going back to the Magna Carta. I'm just among the common people who are custodians of that freedom while we're alive. Edmund Burke said it's a contract between the dead, the living, and the yet to be born. I started off by reading a lot of left-wing books and commentary and was very, very briefly persuaded by that. But then I stumbled on a book called Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman. The worst of the Trudeau socialist years were coming to bear. Highest misery index in Canadian history. That's unemployment plus inflation. And
that was under Justin's father.
Yes.
Surprise, surprise. Yes.
And here we are with the same policies leading to the same results, just as the dog returns to its vomit and the sow returns to its mire, the burn fool's bandaged finger goes wobbling back to the fire, as Kipling would write.
Yeah, so there you have it, folk. I mean, that's the character of Pierre. He's a guy who got really into conservative politics when he was like 14, joined the conservative club, argued on the internet about it, and like generally quotes Kipling at length in casual conversation, starting with the dog returns to his vomit without notice. Like, he didn't say, I'm about to quote Kipling. He's just like, the dog returns to his vomit, the sow returns to his mire, and the burnt fool's bandaged hand returns, as Kipling would write.
To the fire, as Kipling would write. He would.
That's like how he talks at home to his wife.
Yeah, well, and he's dropping that other quote. He's like, Edmund Burke would say this, and like you can tell that that's how he speaks, right? He doesn't do that anymore.
Yeah, his natural instinct is to be a 15-year-old conservative sued, but they've invested a lot of money.
Well, hey, he was very briefly convinced to be a socialist, but then a glorious book came from down on high, Milton Friedman, and that changed everything for him. And I feel like that, of course, that's his origin story, is that it's Milton Friedman. It's this like whack job far right economist who is like extreme even by liberal pro-capitalist economist standards. He's that type of econ nerd. He's like the person who's online arguing with communists being like, excuse me, have you ever read Econ 101? And like, it's not true capitalism if there's even a single regulation.
So that's Pierre. That's naked Pierre underneath the makeup, underneath the Botox, underneath the training. You peel back the layer a bit. Just look a couple years back in the interviews when he's still wearing the glasses. He's still quoting Kipling about dogs eating vomit. And you can see who he really is. The next quote we want to play, this is, I think, just a fascinating, illuminating quote in some ways. Peterson asked him, conservatives are tempted to go woke. What's going to make you different?
How do you feel about the probability that if the Conservatives in Canada take power, that they'll be enticed into this global utopian delusion that seems to have enveloped so many leaders, kind of regardless of their political stripe? What do you think, if anything, can inoculate you or has inoculated you against that?
I know better.
Well, elaborate. What do you mean?
I'm not going to do that. And it will be hard because the temptation will be, this is the mistake that conservative parties around the world have made countless times. They think, well, anybody who's got a conservative mindset is already voting for me, so I can go off and chase the ideas of my political opponents, and then everyone will love me.
Yeah, the framing of like pandering to a global woke utopian delusions being like this temptation.
It's enticing. It's good. People get enticed into it. It's so...
So first of all, God, I wish that woke utopian delusions were in vogue and tempting all the leaders of the world. That it was
like this global trend that people are having such difficulty resisting is like woke utopianism. And Seriously Wrong is the biggest podcast in the world, and all the world leaders are quoting it and saying this is the basic, that I wish it too.
But yeah, it's fascinating. Like, I guess it fits into kind of like Peterson's like biblical narrative of like temptation, rejecting temptation and redemption and so on. In the other older interview, he also talks about it being tempting to fund the CBC despite promising to cut funding.
Another evil thing that you could do is fund the CBC.
Yeah, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation are like, if you know, BBC in the UK is kind of like that. And he frames it also as like this temptation that, they'll give you better media coverage if you protect their funding and stuff. And then, but also Pierre says like, yes, it's going to be tempting, but I'm going to resist it.
It's funny that his first two answers were so terse. Like he almost sounded annoyed the second time when Peterson asked him to elaborate. He's like, well, I'm not going to do it.
I'm not going to do that.
Like, but you never hear, if you ask the progressive, if you ask Bernie, how are you going to resist the funding from APAC? How are you going to resist the funding from big business and stuff to change your votes and stuff? You ask AOC that or something. They're not going to be like, well, it'll certainly be tempting, but I'm going to resist.
Right. Yeah, no, that's true.
So yeah, I just found it fascinating that he repeated this frame of like, yes, global woke utopianism knocking at my door. I mean, I'm going to have to fight it off every day and it's going to be hard, but I think I can.
But then, he's also saying that like conservatives, have this temptation to try to appeal across the aisle by using the rhetoric or promising things from the other side, and then everyone's going to love you. But like, he's also kind of doing that throughout this whole interview. And we played a little bit last time where he was talking about like working people and stuff. We'll play a little bit more this time, but he's doing the populist right thing of incorporating some anti-establishment, anti-elite messaging, which is doing that. Like he's pandering to certain aspects of the left who might be brought over by that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, and I think I want to make kind of a nuanced point about this, but there's two main aspects of this point. The first is that he's right that if you're in a party that has a strong reputation of being either on the left or right, you have to commit to the lane you're in. And like we saw in the Kamala Harris campaign most recently, but there's tons of examples of like Democratic and liberal campaigns where they're like, tough on crime, balance the budget, this kind of stuff. And they're trying to like go to this sort of mushy middle where the right doesn't believe you and the left loses all passion for you. And then you are stuck in this like worse zone than either. And so he's making that point. And like, you can see that what he's doing is working. So like on one hand, point one for the socialists, the Bernie types in the US who've been arguing that Kamala and Biden and stuff were screwing up by going to the center. Because we see in practice in Canada, we have this conservative party that's ascendant by committing to signaling themselves as conservatives. And that's part of it. But then also, like you're saying, it's not just that he's going hard conservative, like populist conservatism that the type that he's doing, it's not going to the center and being like, oh, we're going to have diversity and inclusion in our strong military or something like that, where you're kind of upsetting both sides, which would be like the wrong kind of going to the center by this metric or whatever.
Right,
But he's doing something where he's trying to pick up niches. So he's like signaling as part of the right. He's signaling as like core to the right, freedom, that kind of stuff. But then there's a lot of strategic, and it's smart. Like if you're watching this through a campaign analysis lens, you know, the way that a filmmaker watches films to try to tell if, you know, if the cinematography is good and stuff. If you're looking at this through the lens of like campaigning, values aside, they actually do some really clever stuff in terms of how they reach across the aisle, talking against the elites. He mentions cutting corporate welfare at one point, which to him, what that means, God knows. But like, it's got a populist common sense kind of like giving money to corporations is bad. You know, the type of people who support RFK, that kind of like crunchy, post-Occupy, kind of like esoteric, lefty, weird something or other, like,
yeah,
people,
conspiratoid-ish, but like...
There's all these spectrums here, and like, but there's different groups of people, and like pandering to Bitcoin. Like during his leadership race, he said that Canada was going to invest in Bitcoin, and then he took a little bit of an L for that in the media because he said this right before Bitcoin had the big crash a couple years back. So like he had just been trumpeting Bitcoin, that Canada's going to invest in Bitcoin to like protect against inflation, and then immediately after Bitcoin crashed. So now he doesn't really talk about that in those exact terms, but he'll still pander to the Bitcoin people and be like, we need crypto, we need innovation, we need Bitcoin. And like, that's a niche thing. And so like overall, like what's the lesson here to take for a left candidate is commit to being on the left, commit to a social politics, commit to a politics of care, and then think of how you can make appeals to niche subgroups outside of your core group to build the coalition without watering down your message.
Yeah, there's a difference between signaling to the center, like what Kamala Harris did, and being like, oh, you know, we need sensible immigration policies and like be strong on the border and stuff. Like that's like, or like if Poilievre was saying like diversity, equity, inclusion, or like signaling to the center, like nobody really likes, because nobody really likes the center that much. But the things that he's doing,
and they
that
just don't believe you too, right? Like,
yeah, the things that he's doing that cross the aisle are signaling to more radical segments of the left, like saying like, oh, all these policies hurt the working class and funnel money up to the richest people, and like that's bad. Isn't something that centrists say. That's something that people on the further left say. It's like it's giving you a bit of outsider cred on the other side. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he says working class too, which like you don't even hear the NDP say that for most of its recent history. And the NDP is like the Social Democratic Party. Yeah. They say things like the middle class or working class families or working families sometimes, which is, I always found that phrase funny. I would just imagine a little baby like on the factory line.
The whole family working together, yeah.
Let's roll another one of these clips.
Yes. I mean, all the socialist policies in practice redistribute from the working class to the super wealthy in practice. Mm-hmm. And I can prove that again and again and again.
In theory.
In practice.
Yeah.
In practice, they all the redistribution that happens in these so-called socialist countries ultimately goes from the working class to the super wealthy.
Yeah, he says working class there multiple times. And I don't think it's a coincidence that he says it when they're talking about socialist policies.
The other day you called it making the socialist case for anti-socialism, something like that.
Well, like, yeah, I mean, the idea that every socialist policy ends up funneling money to the richest people, like, just doesn't make any sense. Like, if you think about the types of policy that socialists propose, they're always like wealth transfers from the wealthy to the poor. They're social programs, taxes on the ultra rich. Like, you know, here's a socialist policy that I would like to see: a maximum wealth. You know, you reach a certain amount of wealth, and then anything you gain after that, maybe you keep some tiny percentage, but the rest, like, how does that transfer money to the wealthiest people in the world by putting a cap on wealth? There's certain things that are just like fundamentally illogical about saying that. Like, I think what he's gesturing at is that Justin Trudeau is a socialist in his eyes, and Justin Trudeau's policies funnel money to the wealthiest people, which in some sense they probably do, a little less than his policies would, but both liberal and conservative policies tend to protect the wealth of the wealthiest people. So that, you can say that about Justin Trudeau's policies, and if you're claiming they're socialist, then I think that's where he's coming from, but it's just like, a weird signaling game to try and like out-socialist the socialists by using socialist morals to say that socialism is bad.
Yeah, it's a classic centrist and right trope to say, like, I agree with the outcome you're seeking, but there's a second order result of your proposed policy that actually makes things worse. So by having diversity quotas at universities, you're actually going to disadvantage XYZ students, or by seeking racial equity, you're going to create racism. By putting in rent control, you're actually going to raise rents. It's a type of thinking about politics that I think brings a lot of comfort to anti-socialists. And like, there are cases you can point to of some policies do have blowback effects and stuff. Like,
sure, yeah,
that's possible. But that sliver of truth that such a thing is possible and exists is used as a comfort blanket to the conservative/centrist mindset to be like, those crazy socialists, they're proposing this policy that's actually going to work against their ultimate goals. But I'm smart and I know to not be tempted by these utopian wokist policies and so on.
The best way to increase people's wages is to eliminate the minimum wage. The best way to, like all these like counterproductive things, like, you put this in an old episode one time. The best way to have the town painted blue is to get out your buckets of red paint.
Yeah, and it's a comforting thing to people who feel mixed feelings about the fact that their values seem to be reflected by a left-wing politic that they're not ready to co-sign. On its face, though, like the general comment, like you said, socialist policies always create this other outcome is just absurd on its face. I don't think any person would actually believe that in the world.
Yeah, I wish they'd go into examples of it, but it's like mid a discussion of inflation and they're saying it kind of about inflation, and then they go back to more topicking about inflation. So he never actually justifies this. Or if anyone out there ever interviews Poilievre, please ask him like more examples of this. What are all the...
Yeah, and he says he can...
he can prove it in every case. Remember, every case.
And what do we count as socialism is like a contested thing, but if we're talking about like in the socialism is when government does stuff kind of way, which is usually what the Milton Friedman school is attacking, we have socialized healthcare in Canada where when I go to the hospital, it doesn't cost me any money. That is paid for by what is called an employer payroll tax, which is corporations above a certain size pay a percentage on their payroll to the government to cover the healthcare costs in our province.
Yeah, that's in BC.
Yeah, that's in BC. Similar things exist in other provinces as well, but that's what BC has now. And that is a policy that explicitly, if you're poor, you get to go to the doctor for free. And it's paid for explicitly by large corporations in particular. Our access to healthcare is the envy of Americans to the point where I try to not mention it to my American friends because they genuinely get upset at me for lording over them how I went to the hospital.
Yeah, it's like embarrassing to hear Americans talk about healthcare sometimes because you're just like, oh yeah, well I would have just gone to the doctor. If that had happened to me, like it wouldn't, Yeah,
and poor Americans lose their lives over this. Like they literally die because they didn't go to the hospital. And for us, every time I've been injured where I was like, yeah, I need a doctor to see this, I never once have been like, oh gosh, what's it going to cost me? I've never had to think that in my life. And it was paid for by big corporations. But the premise of like the socialist case for anti-socialism thing too, I think is really interesting because it's kind of like this paradox within the structure of right populism. Like we mentioned in the last episode, these kind of contradictory threads, like the example came up of go out into the wilderness, be responsible and start a family. Young people, they want to sow their wild oats and they also want to be like responsible family men at the same time. It's like these two opposite things being slammed together and treated as a coherent thing, even though there's a non sequitur and it's contradictory. Right populism is this fake strain of populism where you make the socialist case for anti-socialism, where you make the case for supporting the system as a form of rebellion. And it's just like such a naked example of the poverty of this politics, like of the bubbling contradictions and non sequitur and incoherence under the surface. And they're trying to convince us that not only are these things consistent, but they're the same, but they just could never be. And like, I think part of our job here in Canada, if you're a Canadian listener, it's like, how do we articulate that to people who are going to consider voting for this piece of shit?
Yeah, I think it does say something about your politics when, like, and I think it appeals to the kind of angry nerd Poilievre type person to be like, well, actually, you have to aim for the opposite of what you want in order to get what you want. If you want to transfer wealth from the wealthy to the working class, don't vote for the people who say they're going to do that. Vote for the people who say they're going to get out of the wealthy people's way, because once you get out of the wealthy people's way, then the opposite of that will happen and the wealth will go to the working class. Yeah, this idea that like whatever you do, the opposite will happen for so many of these things is like a weird fundamental contradiction of how a lot of conservative politics have to represent themselves to the people, because they're not going to be attractive to the people if you say, we're here advocating for the interests of big business, we're here advocating for the interests of rich people against the working class. That's not like popular to anyone. But if you frame it the opposite way, then like the dog returns to his vomit and the sow returns to his mire and the bird fool's bandaged finger goes wobbling back to the fire, you can get people to vote conservative again and again and again, because you're sort of tricking them into thinking that it's going to do the opposite of what the actual policies are.
Yeah, and speaking of like fake populism, one of the aspects of Pierre is he like uses the rhetoric of YIMBYs around like unleashing the market and housing supply and stuff like that. Progressive YIMBYs I know still don't like him, and they think he's like appropriating their progressive arguments or whatever. But I think I just wanted to give a moment to point out something, which is that all the market logic of YIMBYism is a way to try to fix the housing crisis that you see increasingly progressive people are convinced by these arguments. Whereas like, as we covered in the show elsewhere, like we're more public housing, social housing, co-op housing kind of people. All of these logics about like, all of these arguments about unleashing the market, allowing competition, and like rooting the high cost of housing in all of these areas of like market inefficiency is functionally identical to similar arguments around privatizing healthcare that people like Pierre would also advance. It's functionally identical to arguments around a variety of social programs like childcare and so on, where you say that if you unleash the competition in the market, deregulate, et cetera, that you're going to have the cheapest childcare in the world, even better than subsidized childcare. And fundamentally, if you believe in YIMBY arguments for the right reasons, you mean, well, you're not like a market ideologue and you think it's going to help fix the housing crisis. At the very least, please be cautious of the fact that if you take all of these premises at face value, there are also arguments to dismantle the Canadian healthcare system. It's never been lost on me, but when it comes to Pierre, I feel like he's kind of just an embodiment of how this market logic, if we do the work of trumpeting YIMBYism and convince everyone to deregulate and unleash the housing markets, we're also doing the work of giving the tools to the plutocrats to dismantle social safety nets elsewhere. Instead, I would advocate, we should push for collective social good arguments.
We print money and borrow money and then flood the economy with that money.
Okay, so that's the inflationary problem.
Yes.
Inflation particularly punishes people who are thrifty and who save.
Yes, but no one ever votes to have the money printing happen. So the inflation is adopted secretly, and you blame the grocer because groceries are more expensive, or your realtor because when in fact it was actually the government that bid up all of those things with money printing, and you didn't even know about it.
Yeah, so for a big chunk of this interview, they're talking about inflation and government spending causing inflation, kind of like
printing money. And then there's this idea among a certain subset of that economics 101 type nerd that I said Poilievre is, that believe that inflation is directly just caused by printing money. That's the major only cause of inflation. The more money you print, the more inflation there will be, which is not true for a lot of reasons. Even the people who really believe that, who are economists, would say that it only causes inflation if the productive capacity isn't growing in line with the amount of money. If you have productive capacity growing, but less and less money, then you would have deflation, which is actually bad for an economy in a capitalist sense.
Yeah, it's kind of like this common sense folk theory of inflation and money supply that's like really popular. I remember hearing it growing up and stuff like that. But the way that the modern economy works is actually just definitely not like that. The argument is just objectively known to be wrong. Like most of the money supply, they have this complex thing. It's like there's M0, M1, M2, M3. You might have heard of this before. And M0 is like actual physical money. M2 is like short-term deposits that could be used. M3 is this long-term deposits. M4 is like more speculative. I can't remember the exact but it keeps on going up. So the actual amount of money supply in the world isn't a single number either. There's like hard money supply, and then there's soft money supply, and it gets softer and softer and a bigger number. But the way that the money supply on Earth fluctuates is through loans, both public and private sector loans, that if I loan as a bank, I loan you $100,000 and $100,000 is placed in your bank account, that doesn't come from anywhere. They don't check the reserves or anything. It's just like the money supply increases by $100,000. And as you pay it back plus interest, the bank keeps the interest and the rest of it is extinguished and goes into non-existence. So the biggest contributor to increasing size of money supply is actually private loans.
Yeah, the amount of debt that people and businesses are currently incurring, how much debt there is a huge impact on the money supply, much more so than government, quote unquote, printing money.
Yeah, so if you get a mortgage or if you finance your laptop and pay it off over 12 months, or you have outstanding credit card debt, any of those things increases the money supply. No one believes that causes inflation. And there's a lot of debate on, it's not like a settled question, definitively where inflation comes from in every sense. But there's things that we know contribute to it, and there's things that we know at the very least don't always contribute to it. Like following the 2008 financial crisis, the US did what was called quantitative easing, which is adding a bunch of money to the money supply. So this isn't loan-based creation, this is actual money printing. And even though they added trillions of dollars to the economy, there was stable inflation for like 10 years after that. There was no massive spike. And in the current situation with what's being pinned on Trudeau, and you could argue that he could have managed it better or spent the money better or focused on better things, and I certainly would join you in that. But there was global inflation, and there's no correlation between the amount of government spending and the amount of inflation if you look at it objectively on a graph. And things that do contribute to rising prices right now are actually, so just one more interesting thing. We're going to have to talk about this more at length at some later date, maybe its own episode. So the tools that central banks have to affect money supply is typically not printing money. Typically, it's adjusting interest rates. If you have lower top-level interest rates, that means the money supply increases more because people can get cheaper credit. They're more likely to get credit. If you have higher interest rates, the money supply is going to decrease because people don't want to take on the costs of the extra interest. So, for example, if someone's buying a house with a mortgage or whatever, a lower interest rate means they can afford a more expensive house. A higher interest rate means that they can't anymore. But what this means is that higher interest rates decrease the money supply, but they also raise prices. Because if you think about like a coffee shop owner who is taking out a loan to rent a place to sell coffee and they're paying a higher interest rate, the cost of that interest needs to be passed on to the customers. And so therefore, the price of an average cup of coffee is going to be higher to pay off the interest on the loan to rent the place. So decreasing the money supply actually, by one of the measures that we have to do so as governments, paradoxically increases inflation because you have the embedded cost of interest and more goods. Another thing that contributed to inflation over the last 5 years since COVID is supply chain issues that related to COVID measures and then other supply chain issues down the road. Again, that increases inflation because it becomes more expensive to do things or there's less supply of things.
Yeah, there was also all those news stories going around about grocery inflation specifically, and that many of the big grocers in America and United States and things were saying directly that they were charging more money because people were willing to pay it. And that, they were having record profits during this time. They were basically using these global supply chain issues and other things as an excuse to raise prices even further than they needed to because of the inflation that was happening in their costs. But they knew that consumers knew that this was happening, and they were able to raise prices even higher to create more profit. So like opportunistic profit-seeking entities also can directly cause important items to start costing more money, like groceries.
Yeah, they call that greedflation.
Greedflation, right.
It is a real factor. It's disputed how much of a factor all these things are together, but it is true. You cannot post record profits during a time of increasing prices unless you're increasing prices more than the costs.
Yeah.
So the evidence is out in the open. During a time of inflation, if you have record profits, that means that you've inflated prices beyond inflation, mathematically speaking.
Yeah. Another thing that Poilievre says in here that isn't true is that inflation is another thing that's a wealth transfer from the poorest people to the richest people, because rich people can afford inflation-proof assets like fancy bottles of wine and art and stuff, which are weird examples.
He's definitely talking from lived experience. Like, oh, this inflation. Well, at least my fancy bottle of wine. Maybe that's your experience, Pierre. But
if you were to
us working class Joes don't know what that's about.
If you were to talk to a financial advisor about what inflation-proof assets you should buy, they would probably just be like, well, invest in like funds that track the market and stuff. They wouldn't be saying like buy fancy bottles of wine or collectibles or other weird shit like that. It's a weird thing to say, but also inflation can hit different groups of people in different ways. If you have a lot of credit card debt, for example, inflation could effectively reduce the amount of debt you have, because the debt you have becomes worth less. So people who have a lot of debt, inflation can be helpful for them. People who own houses, so like middle-class people, inflation can be really beneficial for them, especially if, as usually happens, housing prices are outpacing inflation, so they're increasing faster than inflation. Then the inflation in housing prices means that your net worth is increasing more than the rate of inflation in the economy. There's a bunch of like weird things like that. So it really depends on a lot of different things who is going to be hit hardest by inflation. It's not like a straightforward wealth transfer to the richest people.
One thing that comes to mind is like often Canadian conservatives will advocate for a flat tax, like a 10% income tax across the board. What they don't like about inflation is that, inflation is a flat tax, essentially, if you're thinking about it in the framework of taxes, but it's a wealth tax. It's 10% of wealth. And then there's exceptions for things that go up in value, et cetera. It's been covered. But like if you have $10 million in your bank and there's inflation that depreciates it by $1 million worth of use, effectively you've lost $1 million. And if you have $10 in your bank, you've effectively lost $1. So the person who only has $10 is already in a tough situation. I'm sure losing $1 isn't going to make it better for them. But to argue they've been hit harder than the millionaire, I think is kind of questionable.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in a sense, they've been hit harder in that $1 probably has more, what's that term, marginal value to them than even the $1 million for the 10 millionaire. But I mean, it's definitely not straightforward in the way they're saying.
Yeah, not arguing in favor of inflation here necessarily, but
yeah,
he's lying. Yeah, and one last thing to point out before we leave this on. This is kind of a complicated, interesting idea, but I hope people find it as interesting as I do. This was pointed out to me by Ryan from the Neighbor Science podcast that we've had on the show previously, which is that there is a weird kind of way in which money supply increasing the cost of things is sometimes true, but it actually makes the argument for government investment in social services even stronger. And that is that some of the places that have the most rampant kind of inflation, the rampant amount of growth in the cost of things, are American healthcare, the housing system, and the costs of attending university or college. These are all places where there are unique private debt mechanisms to take on loans to pay them off. And obviously, when you take out a loan, you're creating money that disappears as you repay it back. And these are all places where we've had big growth in the costs of these things because these are all profit-seeking institutions. And the amount of money that people can afford to pay for these things when it's turned into debt is higher than they could pay if they were paying out of pocket. So what that means is that speculation, profiteering, and so on can thrive in these instances where there's specific targeted financialization systems that can increase the cost of things and therefore contribute to inflation through one particular thing. By having a debt mechanism attached to that particular thing, you help inflate the cost of that thing. And so in all those cases are places that if the government took a proactive role in investment and providing things as human rights, it would prevent that inflation. The cost of implementing healthcare would be lower with less profit seeking. The cost of implementing free tuition and going to university would be cheaper in a non-profit and debt-driven system. The housing market would be better if there was public options for housing and so on. So in a way, sometimes increasing money sometimes causes direct inflation in a specific area over time. But if you understand what that really means, it's an argument for socialization.
So it is a classic for socialists. What they try to do is change their names and move on and try to have everyone forget their past. And when I say that socialists changed their names, I mean, they were communists, and then they became socialist, and then they became social democrats, and then they stole the word liberal, and then they ruined that word, so they changed their name to progressives, and then they changed their name to woke, and now they claim they don't want to be called woke anymore. Because socialists always try to disown the things they've done because it's manifestly disastrous.
When he started saying this, it was like a real mind wrinkle for me. Like at first I was like, what the fuck is he talking about? Socialist? Like, are you talking about someone in particular? Like some guy you knew who changed his name and tried to forget about the past? And then he explains his historical context, and then like pedantically, I want to be like, well, actually, social democrat was a popular term.
It's completely
pre-communism.
ahistorical. Socialists and communists were never the same thing. They were like two different ideologies that were like related, and social democrats existed at the same time, and they were like a different group. They've always been different groups: socialists, communists, social democrats. We never changed our name to woke as like a replacement for socialist, and liberals were also never socialist. They're liberals who, might be in favor of some social programs sometimes, but this is that conservative idea that anything to the left of center right, inclusive of center right, all of that is socialism.
Yeah.
Like a single government regulation is like one socialism on top of your pristine capitalism beneath it.
But even if we wanted to like accept a sequential, only one term at a time narrative of history, he got the order wrong.
Right.
But also all these distinctions matter in terms of the arguments within these different political groups. Like they represent different positions. And then also, the woke example, it's like woke for a brief period of time was like a positive connotation, like slang term that was used semi-ironically. Like woke, it was never like, we are the wokeists and like this is our organization, like we're forming the woke society of Vancouver.
No, it was like originally a term meaning like, oh, this person understands race issues, and then it was more broadly a term of like, oh, this person understands various intersectional issues of dynamics of oppression in society.
But it was never used like sincerely either. Like woke always had this winking thing to it too, because it was also derived from this premise of like waking up, like in the early 2000s and the 2010s was like this idea of wake up to what's really going on, wake up to the corporate
life, and then I woke up to the reality of the situation.
And then stay woke would mean like about the Illuminati or about racism, and then it got ironized through popular culture. But it had this positive connotation, but it was never like serious and sincere the way you'd be like, I identify as a socialist. No one was ever like, I identify as woke. That never happened. But then it became a slander word of the right increasingly over like the last 6 years or so. So
Also, this is like a nitpicky thing, and it's mostly to do with Canadian politics. But in my experience of Canadian politics, the people who keep changing their names when people don't like them anymore are conservatives. Like the conservatives the federal conservatives were originally called, I think, just conservatives. I can't remember. And then they changed to progressive conservatives. And then now they changed back to conservative and
because there was the Reform Party, which was like a conservative split party, and then that merged in with the Progressive Conservatives and became the Conservative Party.
And then here in BC, there was like the BC Liberal Party, which was the conservative party that was trying to hide the fact that they were more conservative. And they recently changed to the BC United Party because another party calling themselves the Conservative Party came to be. But you look at the NDP, through all those years have just been called the NDP. The Liberal Party through all those years have just been called the Liberal Party federally. So who's changing their name, who's running from their past and trying to disassociate and stuff. In Canadian politics, it's been the right.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing that we know for sure is conservatives, they always change their name. They always move and they try to forget about the past. If we want to summarize this very quickly, Pierre is a hypocrite. The conservatives have done exactly what he's accused us socialists of. And as utopian wokists here on the Seriously Wrong podcast, these colors don't run. We don't run away from our past. Listen to those old episodes. Yeah, sure, we're still learning. Sure, we make some mistakes. 90% of it, solid gold, baby. Nothing to run away from here. We're library socialists through and through. Utopian wokists.
Sure, yeah.
No bones about it.
Yeah, we didn't have the term library socialism at the beginning. We thought that up, but that wasn't like a name change. We were just, playing with different ideas.
Yeah, we weren't running away from our past.
We've kept the podcast name the same the whole time. We've never been like, oh, we have to run away from our old episodes, start a new podcast. Yeah, no, it's just is weird revisionist, making up shit history. The idea that they just go putting on a trench coat and glasses and being like, I'm socialist now, but secretly it's the exact same thing. Yeah, it's goofy.
Yeah, it's also sort of an evocative metaphor, I guess, in a way, but it's it also requires you buying into
a lie.
Yeah, and it just also felt like talking to a crazy person for a second when he's like, socialists always do this. It's like, what are you talking about? And he's like, let me explain. I'm talking more metaphorically and broad. And it's like, okay, I kind of get what you're saying, but that is an incoherent thought, sir.
The second problem Jagmeet Singh has is that all of his political ideology is implemented now. So,
yeah, right.
And we're seeing it. People look around and say, okay, this is what it looks like. The utopia the NDP has been spinning in the corner of Parliament. They told us everything was going to be free and wonderful and just, and there would be
racial equity.
There would be there would be unicorns and butterflies and rainbows, and this would be the utopia. Well, now that all of their policy agenda, all of their agenda is implemented, and people look around and it's a hellscape. Immigration was not even controversial before Justin Trudeau because it was so well managed here for so long. And we just need to get back to that.
It was clearly viewed as a net benefit by the immigrants and by Canadians.
Absolutely.
Right.
People integrated, they arrived here, and we said to people, look, bring your traditions and culture and your stories, but leave the problems at the door. And, in the last 9 years, we've seen that's come apart. The foreign conflicts are now spilling onto our streets. I want to put an end to that. I want to say, look, we're not interested in the world's ethno-cultural conflicts. We welcome people.
Shadow side of multiculturalism.
And by the way, put aside race, this obsession with race that wokeism has reinserted.
Well, invented in many
ways.
When I moved to Toronto, it was as race blind as any country, as any city could be.
Right.
Right. And that's flipped. We basically, what would you say, imported and invented racism in Canada. Right. As a consequence of policy.
Wokeism seeks to divide people into these different groups and subgroups, and we see the results in a 250% increase in hate crimes. But we're going to get back to the basic principle that people are judged based on their individual character and humanity rather than by their group identity.
Yeah, so there's a lot of like weird race stuff trickled through this.
Racism was imported and invented in Canada. There was no racism until probably like 10 years ago when the wokeists imported it.
Yeah. Oh man, what the hell is he talking about? One funny thing about this is like Poilievre's a politician, and there's certain stuff that he says and there's certain stuff that he doesn't say. And Jordan is a man whose brain is falling apart, who doesn't fully respect that line.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when he's like, yeah, all these great NDP policies like healthcare and stuff, he's like, racial equity, with this like smile on his face, implying like racial equity is impossible. That is egalitarian
It's
relation.
like unicorns.
And then but he tries to like not say no, which is kind of like, as a politician, like he has to advocate for racial equity in some form, right?
Yeah, like you hear him in the immigration thing. He's trying to be neutral on like it.
Yeah,
and also his business buddies don't want to completely end immigration. They just want versions of it where they can control the people and whatnot. But
yeah, and then, but then he says, yeah, unicorns, rainbows, etc., to kind of like plus one, like, yeah, you know, racial equity, unicorns, and rainbows. These three impossible things that NDP are going to promise us.
Also, the idea that the NDP's entire platform has been implemented, no, it hasn't. But you know, we can. It's just a side point, but like,
yeah, let's give that a little
ridiculous
time before the end of the episode. But definitely, no, it hasn't. And then also the stuff about like foreign ethnic conflicts on our streets, and he just muses the shadow side of multiculturalism. Like it's like. It's not like an idea he's having. Like this is like this spring-loaded statement in his back pocket that
he threw that out the same way Poilievre threw out the Kipling quote. Like he knew it. He's just like the shadow side of multicultural. It's a thing that's been stocked up in Peterson's brain. But like, yeah, I don't know what he's talking about, where there was like this past where people came to Canada and left all those foreign wars behind, but now they come here and bring them to Canada's streets. I don't know. Like you had mentioned one particular incident you thought he was talking about, but like when I go out in the streets, Vancouver, a very multicultural city, there's lots of immigrants here and children of immigrants and, you know, lots of different cultures going on. I don't see any wars in the streets. I don't see like foreign wars being brought to our soil here. Like, I don't know what he's talking about that's changed with immigration that Justin Trudeau did. Like, I don't know what he means.
Yeah, I think he's alluding to the Indian government assassinated a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil like 2 years ago.
What does that have to do with Justin Trudeau's immigration policies?
Well, the person who was assassinated was an activist for Khalistan separation, so like Sikh separation within India, who became a Canadian citizen at some point in like the last 20 years. And Jagmeet Singh is also Sikh. So that's the connection, is that he is associating this event with Jagmeet Singh and Trudeau's relationship to imply that this happened because basically... And like, yeah, you got to be pretty plugged in to make these connections. But I think he's kind of dog whistling Jagmeet and saying that like Jagmeet's role in government is causing the BJP in India under Modi to attack Canadian citizens because Singh is sympathetic to this separatist group from India.
Right. Yeah, so, that might be like the more detailed thing he's signaling, but I think like the base messaging here is that like lefties want to bring in hordes of brown people, and that's scary to you white conservatives I'm talking about, and it doesn't really matter what any specific policies are. I'm just going to like mention this before a time when we also had immigration, but it was okay, but now it's horrible and we have to not stop it, but go back to how it was before. Because he's trying to play both sides of the immigration thing and be like, yeah, we're still going to have immigration, but trust me, when I do it, it's going to be great. It's going to be great immigration.
I'm worried about the People's Party eating my lunch, so I'm going to make sure to say at least something racist. But I want
yeah, exactly. But I don't want to promise that I'm going to completely halt it, because like I'm not. That's against business interests.
And then there's a wider thing that we could talk about with this premise of like there used to be this incredible colorblindness in Canada and stuff, which might be what it seems like when you're a white guy in your 20s in the 80s or whatever.
Yeah, I came to Toronto and there was...
But at the same time, so like, this is like a core historic story. Like, I've known this since I was young, growing up in Winnipeg. There used to be this practice in Winnipeg that I think stopped in the 90s. I'm not sure exactly when it ended, but it was really common in the 60s and 70s especially, where police would take Indigenous men in the police cars outside of town, kick the crap out of them, and make them walk back into town themselves to get medical help. So racially targeting Indigenous people for police violence, abandoning them outside of town, having them walk back. They called it moonlight tours. My dad, who's not Indigenous, was taken on a moonlight tour once in the 70s. So my dad at the time had a big tattoo of a wolf and had long hair and was easily mistaken for an Indigenous man.
Jesus.
So like, but he was a ne'er-do-well at this time. So
yeah, he got picked up by the cops. Yeah.
It wasn't exclusively targeted Indigenous people. It's primarily targeted Indigenous people. And it is a historic fact. You can find out details about the Moonlight Tour issue. It's not just Winnipeg either. But also, we could get even broader here and point out that Canada was actually founded on an ethnic conflict, which was the displacement of Indigenous peoples and conflict in taking their land. We currently are recording this on unceded territory. There was no treaty to take this territory. It was taken by force. And in that process, there was tensions between settlers, Indigenous people, and also the Métis, which was a community that was Indigenous and settler intermarried communities. And they actually used, at some points, they created Métis police forces to kind of like give Métis people like an insider card to be part of the settlement, to be part of settler culture in exchange for policing the Indigenous non-Métis people.
Yeah,
like
the idea that racism had nothing to do with the colonization of Canada, the genocide of Indigenous people, like going on even to like residential schools and like, oh, we have to take all of the children of this specific group, this ethnic group of Indigenous people, and put them into schools to make them more like white people. Oh yeah, that was the time when there was no racism in Canada, and it was perfect before all these wokeists came. And
yeah, and there's been ethnic conflicts between French and English Canadians historically. There's been ethnic conflicts in different communities where you have like rival gangs that are ethnically constituted. This goes back decades as well.
Yeah, by every definition of racism, there's examples of it. And also then like, yeah, at the end, he's like defining wokeism as splitting people up into their group identities and judging them based on those group identities, which has caused this huge rise in hate crimes. Earlier, he was saying wokeism is just another name for communism, which is an economic system in which private property is abolished and the common people control the means of production. But now he's saying wokeism is actually defined as basically being racist by judging people by their group identity rather than the content of their character. So it's a completely different definition of wokeism he's using here than before. But then also, yeah, like blaming the rise in hate crimes on people being against racism, which is one of the actual primary origins of the term wokeism, is being against racism. Blaming the rise of racism on people being against racism is yet another example of that conservative thing of like, whatever you aim for, the opposite will happen. So if you try to be against racism, hate crimes go up. So what you have to do is be racist and then hate crimes will go down, I guess.
Be neutral in some way that, and there's like, it's self-evidently an incoherent and unsupportable statement to say that hate crimes being on the rise is a result of anti-racism initiatives. That's just, I think it almost doesn't merit response, but I think we also should just like, what causes a rise in hate crimes? Okay, well, you have like white supremacist, fascistic, far-right groups on the rise right now. So when you're talking about genuine hate crimes, there's like a whole media infrastructure, the same media infrastructure that Jordan Peterson is paid by and that has helped aid the rise of Pierre, which is stoking racial animus. If you look in places like YouTube and Twitter and stuff, where you have Rising West blue check account on Elon Twitter or whatever, there's a concerted, moneyed effort to genuinely create racial animus and to build up a white racial identity that is built on resentment towards immigrants and so on. This is happening all over the Western world, and it's well funded on one hand. And then also you have, when you measure hate crimes, a lot of these hate crime measures are including Palestine solidarity marches as a hate crime against Jewish people. So I'm not sure what specific stat he's referring to, but in similar stats I've seen that show, oh, there's this huge rise in hate crimes. Once you remove the Palestine solidarity marches, which are by no reasonable definition a hate attack on Jewish people, they're criticisms of the militaristic nature of the Israeli state. Once you remove them, the skyrocketing hate crime numbers aren't nearly what they're claimed to be.
I think what he's gesturing toward here is a common thing that you see fascists do online, which is, you pushed me towards this. The reason you can blame wokeism for the rise in hate crimes is that, like, wokeism is so mean to white men all the time that it's a justification for it almost. It's saying, like, it was inevitable. You pushed us to this. You made us do this. He doesn't explicitly say that, but that's like where I see his train of logic before this coming to. Because I've even heard Jordan Peterson say basically that exact same thing. Like, when they do admit that there's a problem on the far right of like these extreme racist weirdos, they always want to say that the only reason they exist is because wokeists have pushed them so far that it was inevitable that they were going to stand up for themselves. And even in that framing, it's justifying it. They do it all the time.
Yeah, no, and in that framing too, I mean, it's interesting. I think we've talked about this on the show in the past, but in that anti-woke kind of framing, when it comes to like the rise of the far right, and like I'd be even willing to concede that there are probably ways that different liberals and leftists can contribute to like unvirtuous cycles and making people be radicalized against very reasonable ideas. Like, it's not beyond the pale to suggest there's things that individuals can do better to try to, you know, invite everyone to be part of the team and stuff. Like, that's fine.
Yeah,
like, we can talk in detail about what that actually looks like. But this whole framework basically says, like, Nazis have no agency. They are these robotic, you know, feed in woke Nazism comes out kind of thing. However, college students, the blue hairs, the wokeists, they have all the agency. What they do is their choice, and how people respond to them is not their choice. And I've always found that like agency shell game really interesting and stupid. Like, if we believe in a political cosmology that all the errors of the right are just natural mechanical responses to the errors of the left, like, obviously that's appealing if you want to say that the right is perfect and the left sucks, but it just doesn't make sense on a basic level. It's like, why do we give college students the keys to the entirety of political society that if they're unprincipled, if they're inconsistent, or if they step out of line, then that justifies someone mechanically, like without any agency or choice, turning into Hitler? Look what you made me do. You know, like, it's just everyone in the picture needs to have agency. Otherwise, you're not talking about something real. See, when we're talking about like weird racism stuff in this interview, we should probably also talk about how Pierre Poilievre's political career has had a
number of racially tinged controversies, let's say.
Like 6, 7 territory, and like these are individual controversies.
Some of them more major than other ones, but yeah, it's come up a bunch of times.
And that's not even including, like, you could say the Harper government's treatment of indigenous people was systematically racist. He was part of that, etc. But not even talking about that, just on an individual level. Like in 2008, Pierre was made to apologize by Prime Minister Stephen Harper because he said something.
Money was being used to compensate former students of the residential schools, and he said that he wasn't sure Canada was getting value for all of this money, and that my view is we need to engender the values of hard work and independence and self-reliance.
And this is like a court case where people who were systematically abused by the Canadian state as children were being given financial compensation for like...
Yeah, being taken away from their parents against their will, kept in abusive residential schools that were like physically and mentally abusive.
Yeah.
And yeah, at the very least, they should get a payout.
Yeah, and these residential schools are part of the argument that Canadian treatment of Indigenous people meets the internationally recognized definition of genocide. And he's saying instead of settlement money, you should teach them to work harder, which was controversial. He apologized for it, but represents, I think, disinterest in the well-being of Indigenous people in Canada.
What a despicable thing to say. We should teach them to work hard. They don't know how to work hard is the implication there, which is fucked up. And also that working hard is somehow compensation for extreme wrongs that have been committed against you. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and within the last couple of years, he spoke at this right-wing think tank in Winnipeg called the Frontier Center for Public Policy, about trying to connect with his right-wing buddies in Winnipeg. And that organization, they're residential school deniers. So he's spoken and affiliated with organizations that are actively denying that this stuff happened, going even further and trying to appeal to the right-wing base or whatever.
Another weird racial controversy that came up is in 2009 in the House of Commons, he used the term tar baby to refer to the carbon tax. It was a weird, basically saying that this person who fathered the carbon tax wants to put it up for adoption. And then, he used that phrase that is a derogatory phrase used against Black children. And he refused to apologize for that one. He instead saying that it's a common reference that refers to issues that stick to one, that stick to somebody. So he was just saying I don't apologize for this. If it was something that he genuinely had no idea was racist and he cared about racism, then when people pointed out that it was racist after he said it, he would apologize for it. So to me, the fact that he refused to apologize for it further cements the idea that he probably already knew that and didn't care. Or if he didn't already knew it, then once he was made aware of it, he didn't care.
Yeah, there's some old folk story of a baby covered in tar sticking to someone. But it's also used as according to the Oxford English Dictionary, it's listed as a slur against Black and Indigenous children. This guy knows. He knows it's a contested term. He chose to use it, and then he chose to not apologize for it. I tend to think this is part of some sort of dog whistling strategy, and trying to trigger a reaction kind of thing. And then more recently as well, when he was leader, actually, he said the N-word in the House of Commons. He was referring to someone whose last name is someone who's Punjabi, whose last name was Nijar. And he says the N-word and then corrects himself and just moves on without acknowledging it.
Yeah, Nijjar. It doesn't look like the N-word. It doesn't sound like it's saying it out loud. People do slip up and, but that's a weird slip up, very specific. And
he said it properly earlier in the same...
Yeah, 30 seconds before he said the name properly without the slip up. And it's when you hear it, it's he fully says, it sounds like it. I don't know.
Yeah,
we don't have a chip inside his head, but it's weird.
Yeah,
it's weird.
To measure his brain to see what he's trying to do. I actually, it's really hard for me to believe that word is not spring-loaded in this guy's vocabulary in a way for him to slip up in this way if you find the clip. It's not like he started saying it and then corrected himself. It's he fully got it out, really fast.
Yeah.
And as there's a lot of racism in Canada, but also there's a lot of racism specifically in Alberta, probably more than your average province by some amount.
I grew up in Alberta and can confirm racism was pretty common when I was growing up.
There was also a controversy around he was advertising on this racist website called the J.ca, which was it's a pro-Zionist website, but it had articles that were racist to Black, Indigenous, Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim people. And he was called out for advertising on that website specifically. There was a minor controversy in the first Peterson interview where he referred to using simple Anglo-Saxon words as his preference.
Yeah, Jordan Peterson asks him, why should people trust him? And he says, because he likes to use simple words, simple Anglo-Saxon words, which was really funny to me because You could say that sentence in a much simpler way. Anglo-Saxon is not a simple word. In that interview, he's not using simple words a lot of the time. He's talking about the Magna Carta and quoting Kipling. He's doing all this weird shit. He's just clearly not doing what he's saying. And in the very sentence, he's not doing what he's saying. Using the term Anglo-Saxon words is very bizarre because you could just say English words if that's what you mean. Anglo is English. I don't know what an Anglo-Saxon word is. Like, do you use some Saxon words? Do you like to use simple German words, Germanic words? Like, you like to use simple words in all the Germanic languages? Or was this a dog whistle about like white people? Like, I'm going to make things more white again. I'm going to... Because that's when I hear the term Anglo-Saxon used in today's world, a lot of the time it's like a weird racial dog whistle kind of thing. And I can't help but think that that's what he meant by saying that he uses simple Anglo-Saxon words rather than just saying simple words. Like, if you wanted to keep the sentence simple, probably just cut out Anglo-Saxon entirely.
Yeah, I mean, and talking about like ancient, like old-timey white ethnic groups just strikes me as like a guy who's a little bit too invested in these are archaic white ethnic groups that you're referring to. It just kind of it raises a soft red flag that in the context of everything else is kind of a hard red flag, that this guy is a little bit too racial for my liking.
Yeah, or a lot too racial.
The socialists, Jagmeet Singh in particular, continually proclaims publicly that he is an opponent of the Trudeau government and is standing up against him while refusing categorically to do the thing that's actually in his power to bring down the government. So do you want to, I just can't understand this at all. So do you want to walk us through this?
Well, let's first of all shed a brief tear for Jagmeet Singh, because the problem he has is that he's trying to be an NDP leader, and we already have an NDP prime minister. I mean, Justin Trudeau is he's actually much more radical than the traditional NDP.
As the NDP themselves admit, the previous leaders of the NDP.
Yes, he attacked the NDP Trudeau attacked the NDP for being too conservative.
Yeah.
But because he had the comfortable blanket of the Liberal Party, which governed for most of the last century, people didn't realize what kind of radical they were dealing with.
Yeah, so our friends who haven't been following Canadian politics as much as Canadian political nerds might, I think, to understand the issues with what we've just heard, we're going to have to give some context. But the premise that, like, he's confused, like, okay, so first of all, right now, Trudeau is prime minister because he has what's called a confidence and supply agreement with the NDP. So the NDP has agreed to give him what's called confidence of the House, which allows him to remain prime minister and prevent an election, even though he has less than a majority of seats.
Yeah.
So basically, the two parties come and they have a written agreement on what shared priorities they might have. And the smaller party gets to make demands of the bigger party on policy priorities that they agreed to implement in exchange for getting to keep the confidence of the House. So in minority government situations where the alternative might be propping up the Conservatives or going to have another election, it's something that's happened many times throughout Canadian history, both the provincial and the federal level, that the more, say, left-leaning parties, or it could be the Liberals and the Bloc Québécois, which is like generally left-leaning and they're just focused on Quebec issues, or it could theoretically happen with the Greens. And it's happened in Germany where there's a grand coalition where the Conservatives and the Liberals team up to have a ruling agreement together, although as far as I know, that hasn't happened in Canada. So that's the type of agreement they have, and that's why the NDP has backed the Liberals, is because the alternative was an election or the Conservatives becoming leaders.
Yeah, so Jagmeet Singh is criticizing Justin Trudeau, and Jordan Peterson is like acting extremely confused as to why he hasn't, done a no confidence motion, like ended their agreement, voted against Trudeau in some key vote that would cause an election to happen. And the obvious answer that they're dancing around, that he's pretending not to know, is that the Conservatives are way, way ahead in the polls right now. So if Jagmeet Singh caused an election to happen right now, the Conservatives would likely win. And he doesn't want that to happen, because as much as he criticizes Justin Trudeau, rightly so, the Conservatives are worse. But he just doesn't want to say that. He wants to pretend that He doesn't understand why he wouldn't want a conservative government. It's just really, like, to me, hammered home the, like, that he's lying here, that they're doing a propaganda piece, that, like, he's pretending not to understand why Jagmeet Singh would prefer a continued liberal government for even a few more months than a conservative government, when, you know, the liberals aren't perfect, but because of this coalition they had, the NDP were able to pressure them into passing that dental plan stuff I mentioned last episode. And yeah, it's like, it's just clearly preferable to be part of a minority coalition with the liberals than to have a majority conservative government where you have no power.
Yeah, and they did manage to get, like, there's a handful of things in the confidence and supply agreement they got, and some of the most prominent things are that they got dental coverage for, like, seniors, disabled people, young people, with a plan to move towards increasing coverage over time. It's like a key NDP priority is to expand the healthcare system to cover dental, pharmaceuticals, and mental health. And they managed to get progress on that front, which is something you can't do as an opposition party. So there's, like, the political trade-offs of getting tied to someone who's unpopular like Trudeau versus getting benefits for people. And I tend to think that what they did in being able to secure positive outcomes is what someone should do in that instance. Like, I don't hold that against them at all. It is somewhat confusing. I think he's playing on, like, low information people who are confused and, like, oh, Jagmeet is Trudeau's guy or whatever, instead of having a kind of frenemy situation where you're both criticizing them and you're allowing them to stay in government because it's better than the alternatives and you're getting something out of it. But, like, these guys aren't low information voters. They understand the calculus in this.
Yeah. And they later go on to claim that it's because he wants to keep his pension. Like, he's
eligible for, like, a larger pension sometime in 2025, apparently.
Yeah, but wouldn't he get that anyway? Like, as long as he keeps running and keeps staying in office? Like, I don't understand this. Like, he might lose, I guess, and then he might lose the pension.
Yeah, and I think it's just unlikely. Like,
it just seems like a bullshit thing to throw out there to, like, slander him that he's doing this thing for personal gain. In order to not admit again, the key point that the Conservatives are worse.
And
but then
Jagmeet's running in a riding that is, like, one of the historic NDP strongholds of Canada that hasn't gone non-NDP in, like, 50 years or something.
Yeah, so unless he, like, announced he wasn't running or something, which, again, like, why would he do? It does. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, also this claim that, like, the NDP got everything they wanted and you look around, this is the NDP utopia. Again, it's so not true that I'm not sure where to start on explaining why and how it's not true. But when you're in a supply and confidence agreement, you really only get to make, like, 1 or 2 or maybe 3 tweaks to the government's plan. You get to have a continuing influence to get, like, little changes here and there, maybe boost more, argue, oh, this should go more to poor people than to people who are middle class, things like that, or we have to include seniors in this program, that kind of thing, and you debate it out. But if it's not in the supply and confidence agreement, then you can't make it a condition of supporting the government as long as you have the supply and confidence agreement. So, like, they focused on getting a few wins that are already benefiting people. Like, I know seniors who are going to the dentist as a result of this kind of agreement. And, like, that's a good thing. It's free. They get to go to the dentist for free. That's cool. But, like, blaming homelessness encampments on the NDP's ideology,
which the NDP, I don't know every platform they've ever had, but a lot of them have included incentivizing social housing. That never happened. I think if we went over and scoured the NDP platforms, there would probably be a lot of things that the NDP wanted to happen that haven't been fully implemented. So just very quickly, I researched this. Here are some things from the NDP platforms of the 2 recent elections. Full dental coverage for everybody. That was not implemented. Even the dental thing, if it comes into effect, it's only for certain people, not everybody.
Yep.
Full pharmacare for everybody has not been implemented. Similar to dental, it's a means test. It's not for everyone.
I'll just say nailed it and nailed it.
Full hearing care for everybody and full mental health coverage for everybody. There's been zero movement on either of those 2 issues.
Nailed it. That's a pretty hype set of promises, by the way, in terms of social democracy. I do find that exciting to think that we could actually do that.
You know, those are all part of healthcare. They should be covered under a full healthcare system. It doesn't make sense that they're not. So great promises. Another one that they had was a wealth tax of 1% on all households with a net worth over $20 million. That was not implemented.
Good policy. Thank you, Jagmeet. I have faith in your leadership, Jagmeet. That's good.
Another one was to roll back the conservative corporate tax cuts from the Harper era, going from 15% back to 18%. It's not a huge difference, but it just, even the smaller things that they were promising didn't happen.
Pragmatic, sensible. I support it.
Increasing the taxable portion of capital gains from 50% to 75% did not happen.
Oh, juicy. Love it.
Capping university tuitions, working toward free post-secondary education for all. So capping of tuitions did not happen, and there has been no free post-secondary education for all.
What did Pierre call it? Spinning a utopia in the corner of the parliament or something like that? The shit's good. This is some good utopia spinning.
Some good platform things here. I like them. Increase the amount of federally protected natural lands from 12% up to 30%. So protecting more and more of our wildlife, our nature preserves, etc., increasing the amount of land.
It's a good start. I like it.
Working with municipalities to eventually make transit rides fare free. As far as I know, there's been zero movement on that.
Yeah.
They're definitely not fare free.
Really good.
Eliminating all fossil fuel subsidies. Has not happened at all.
Nope.
And a $35 billion climate bank. He called it a climate bank that would boost investment in renewable energy, energy efficiency, and low carbon technology. There's been some government programs pushing in that direction because largely of the agreement they have, but I don't think a $35 billion climate bank was ever set aside for that specifically. So
yeah, we're real utopian wokists here. We're, what left-wing people, if we hear a left-wing social democratic platform, our job is to point out its limitations and say it's not good enough.
Yeah.
And that's my instinct going into this episode. But I kind of forgot some of this. Hearing it all together, it's like, good. That's good. That's actually, that's like, yeah.
This is a combo of stuff from 2019 and 2021. But yeah, these are all great proposals. Some of them don't go far enough for me personally. They're a little centrist for my liking, not utopian enough. But in terms of the overall political spectrum in Canada, they are great. All of them should be put into practice immediately.
Yeah, I actually forgot how fire this platform. I think Jagmeet can actually win if you talk about this stuff with people.
Yeah, I don't know if this is all going to be in their platform for 2024, or for 2025, but it definitely should be.
Well, shout out to the team. It's the best federal NDP platform I've seen in my lifetime. This stuff.
And then, claiming that Justin Trudeau is an NDP prime minister and that he's to the left of the NDP. He's more radical than them. He's outflanked them.
And
already.
Even the NDP admits it.
I don't even know what they're talking about.
He's talking about Tom Mulcair, the former leader of the NDP, who has become a...
Oh yeah, wasn't he more of a centrist-y leader?
Yeah, he's on sort of the centrist wing of the... He praised Margaret Thatcher when he was younger and refused to disavow it during the election and stuff. And he's become a talking head in Canadian media where, he gets paid $500 to go be a talking head and shit talk Jagmeet and Trudeau from a NDP lens or whatever.
Right. This is just a way to signal to low information voters who have been fed this idea that Justin Trudeau is a radical communist. They're just playing into that idea that he is already the NDP. The NDP, the New Democratic Party, these social democrats are really just communists in disguise. Justin Trudeau is even more radical than they are. And, it's this again, collapsing of everything from the center, right, left into one group called extremist communists.
Yeah. And there's the way that these fake populists jig it up to confuse people is that there's a sliver of truth in the sense that in the 2015 campaign in particular, when Trudeau became prime minister, he campaigned to the left of the NDP on 3 issues. This was against Mulcair, the centrist NDP.
Right.
He said, we're going to legalize cannabis, which the NDP didn't commit to at that time, even though they first introduced a bill to legalize cannabis in the 70s. He said, we're going to raise taxes on the rich to keep taxes on the middle class the same. Going after the rich wasn't something the NDP did in that campaign, even though they obviously should have in retrospect, as we see the success of things like Bernie and so on. This is 2015, right before the Bernie moment. So
yeah, the NDP were ahead for the first time ever in Canadian history. They were at top of the polls at the start of that election cycle. And then Liberals saw that and outflanked them to the left with the marijuana promise, I think was like the hugest thing there, but also, signaling against rich people and stuff.
And then also electoral reform. They said it would be the last election under first past the post, so it was either going to be a ranked vote or mixed member proportional
Another
vote.
left-wing thing that hasn't been fully implemented yet.
Yeah, and which is in the NDP platform and was this whole time, that the Liberals backed out of very quickly after becoming elected. Trudeau justified it by saying that it would cause far-right parties to be able to take power. And at the time on the show, we said this. We said, under first past the post, far-right people can take power anyways. Just wait. They just take over the big party and then they take power.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, here we are. The far right has taken over the Conservative Party. He's signaling, he's fascist dog whistling and so on to try to prevent the People's Party from eating their lunch. He's about to take power under first past the post because Trudeau broke his promise. So yes, we on the left in Canada are mad at Trudeau and would prefer a different prime minister, but I would take him for another 10 years over this piece of shit.
Yeah. The other interesting thing, about that election that I mentioned where the NDP was briefly on top and then the Liberals outflanked them to the left and actually turned around like they were at the bottom of the polls and shot up to the top of the polls by doing what you were saying, promising these left-wing things, legalizing weed, going after rich people, and ending first past the post. So we're in a situation again where the Liberals are at the very bottom of the polls. This time the Conservatives are on top. So I think what the Liberal Party is going to probably do is to try and signal that they're really conservative too, and like where they're going to do the Kamala Harris route from the last election. They're going to fail miserably. But what they should do if they want to win is signal more left wing to actually like excite the base and like get a leader who has some credibility in that area. I doubt that that's going to happen, but yeah, that's one way I could see them actually like gaining some momentum is like picking a new leader who's kind of seems cool like Justin Trudeau did in 2015 and like picking some good hammer home policies like weed legalization and taxing rich people more that might entice people to vote for them.
Yeah, it's going to be harder in this situation because of like the Lucy football effect of like, oh, now we've got this new charismatic liberal leader who's promising left-wing things again, but like they're just going to pull the football
have been
again.
In power for this long, and
So for me, I kind of feel like the best case scenario for me is for the Liberals to try the rightward economic pivot and like challenge Pierre on that turf and fail miserably at it, but hopefully pull from Pierre some of like get that kind of like radical versus reasonable conservative split happening.
Right.
And then clear up space for the NDP to like gain territory by being that left alternative.
Yeah. And like, I love Jagmeet Singh, but I think he would have to go in order for them to actually rise in the polls and take this because he has too much of that Trudeau stink on him. Just like what they were saying. It's like the common narrative is that he's like Trudeau's lackey who's backing him up. People really hate Trudeau right now. So I think they would also have to like switch leaders. But I mean, maybe he could pull it off and like, but I kind of doubt it.
Yeah, we'll see. I tend to think the same thing. Like if they take this opportunity, if Jagmeet stepped aside and said, I want to spend time with my family, I'm still going to be in the caucus, I'm still going to, like, there's no drama here. It's just that I've got young kids. This is an important moment. We're going to have our leadership race at the same time as the Liberal leadership race.
Yeah.
We can set a direction, get someone who's charismatic, folksy, who isn't tied to Trudeau, who can put forward a strong left campaign. I think that scenario where the NDP sticks to their left bona fides, pushes a further left than Jagmeet did. Although I do want to praise some priorities that they've taken under Jagmeet when compared to Mulcair and Layton. It's genuinely admirable to have a party, for example, that is criticizing what's happening in Israel, like a mainstream party criticizing the Gaza genocide like the whole time. And they could have done better on that in some ways, but still, like compared to the Mulcair era, it's good. But the scenario where the Liberals pivot to the right and the NDP pivots to the left under a new leader and the rightists are at each other's throats and we can have a smiley, happy warrior come up. I think that's the best case scenario of a good outcome here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's like the Hail Mary ideal. A bunch of things fall into place just right. And yeah, that would be amazing. But
Yeah, there's also the possibility of, now Pierre is a creepy freak and he's prone to say bizarre things. He's very well trained right now. But as the tension and as he feels the stress, he's riding high right now. He's confident.
Maybe like some debate slip up where he says something really weird or like
exactly. There's
always a hope that he falls flat on his face in a way that totally.
And then local bozo eruptions too can combine with that. A local conservative candidate says something weird that upsets either the racist constituency or the immigrant constituency or whatever when trying to balance all these things.
Right, yeah.
And then you have enough individual ridings that fall that conservatives become, some old video comes out of them talking about conversion therapy or whatever.
Yeah, because they're trying to get a whole bunch of new seats. Obviously, conservatives don't currently have a majority, so they're running a lot of like new and different MPs and stuff. There's probably some weirdo freaks in that group as well. Yeah. One other quick thing I wanted to mention about this clip is that they're pronouncing Jagmeet Singh's name incorrectly, which is like a common mistake. And in a lot of cases, it's fair enough because the name is spelled Jagmeet. So people pronounce it Jagmeet instead of Jagmeet. But as you pointed out, this has been a thing that's like talked about in Parliament. There's been like, and anyone who is deeply into politics in Canada, the way we are, the way Jordan Peterson and Poilievre obviously are, he's running for prime minister. Like he knows how to pronounce his name and he's choosing not to do it on purpose.
Yeah. And then what that does is when you hear people mispronouncing a name, even if you intend to pronounce it correctly, you might repeat it the wrong way and stuff. And it might seem like a minor thing, but I do think that there is, like, people's names are important, and intentionally mispronouncing someone's name over and over and over again, if someone has a name that is sourced from a foreign country that people are not familiar with, and then you intentionally and repeatedly mispronounce it, it's a sign of intentional disrespect, and it's an attempt to convince more people to mispronounce the name to make someone feel more alien and unwelcome, which I think is a really like nasty type of politics that Pierre's intentionally doing here.
Yeah. It's a shitty thing to do to anyone, especially when someone who's like publicly said multiple times, like, this is how it's pronounced. I prefer if people pronounce it correctly. Yeah, it's just rude.
Yeah. Pierre Poilievre.
Pierre. I love Pierre. Poilievre. We now go to Pierre Poilievre the night before his big election, preparing for his final speech of the campaign season.
No, I gotta move markets here and socialism. I should specify authoritarian here.
Pierre, sir, are you wanting some soda water before you go on stage, sir?
Do I want soda water? Does the dog return to its vomit? Does the sow return to its mire? Does the burnt hand's wobbling finger return to the fire? Yes. I'm parched out of my skull. I have nothing to drink.
Of course, sir. I'll get that right away for you.
Thank you. This isn't socialism. People have to do real work around here. Now, my final speech. Trudeau's authoritarian socialism has... I just feel like it's not working. Maybe I'll try to appeal to a broader audience. I'll make promises for more social programs and then everyone will love Pierre. Everyone... No. I won't do that. I have to stick to my conservative values. But everyone will love me. I'll get everyone's vote. Supermajority Pierre. A prime minister for all Canadians. No. I'm a prime minister for Anglo-Saxon men. They brought me here. I can't give in to this temptation. I have to be different. Oh, come on. Just say a new day is dawning in Canada. That we can all live together peacefully in racial equality. No, not we have to unleash the free market. No, we have to unleash racial equality. Stop it, no. I can do this. Okay. Jagmeet's authoritarian socialist policies have already been tried. There's no such thing as free. No, I like this. In practice, although it might sound good.
Pierre, sir, you've got 2 minutes to speech time, and of course, here's your soda water.
Finally. Oh, Oh, you've
Sir,
done it again.
Is there an issue?
You've really stepped in it. That the dog returns to its vomit. The sow returns to... Right, sorry, let me finish.
Oh, sorry, just as Kipling would write.
Stop it. I am the leader of the conservatives. You are a little worm. I quote Kipling.
Of course, sir.
And I'll start from the beginning. As the dog returns to its vomit and the sow returns to its mire, the burnt fool's bandaged finger goes wobbling back to the fire. You've done it again. 4 ice cubes instead of 3.
I'm so sorry, sir.
Return to your mire, sow.
Yes, sir.
I'm going to address the people, the working class.
And now we're welcoming to the stage, God willing and barring disaster, Canada's next Prime Minister, Pierre Poilievre.
Thank you, everybody. We're starting a new dawn for the people of Canada tomorrow. But first, I want to thank all of the transgender Latinx people of, we're going to cut taxes on industry and unleash the free market system and unleash racial equity and unleash diversity, equality, No, it's all right. It's just that climate change is real. The people who experience racism deserve a reprieve from it. We need to fund childcare and dental care and
Pierre's gone woke.
Let's just get to something epic and iconic.
He's not a sloop anymore. He's woke.
Accepting migrants from war-torn countries. I've said it before and I'll say it again. We need to bring in more.
Pierre's given in to the temptation of utopian wokeness. Get him!
The price on carbon is not high enough. We need a bigger dividend for working families.
What is he doing? Did you write this? I didn't write this.
This speech. Get him off the stage. Get him off the stage.
Giant hook and yank and...
I'd like to apologize for my past racist comment.
We now go back to the future, where a distressed old man is reliving his worst moments.
Oh my God, I can't believe I dropped the ball. It's good old days. I should have... Oh man, they're all picking this up on the brain chip.
Sir, are you going to denounce the olden days before the Trudeau protectorate, or are we going to have to tase you?
Yeah, we're going to tase you badly, sir.
You're running out of time.
I had to run away and change my name and forget the past. I like conservatives always do.
Like the dog returns to his vomit and the sow returns to her mire, the burned fool's bandaged finger goes wobbling back to the fire. That is what conservatives always do. True.
Is this my last stand where I'm tased badly? Or am I going to submit to the woke utopian demands of the Trudeau protectorate? I don't know what I should do. I don't know what's funnier. We didn't plan an ending to this, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think like busting out the tasing sound effects, that would be really fun to tase you. I mean, as a policeman in this scene, I want to tase you, obviously. And, you know, you'd be like, I'm being hurt, I'm being tased. And,
yeah.
Or maybe the Botox person comes in clutch and starts like injecting the cops and fights them off.
Right, and they're so beautiful that they look in the mirror and they look so perfect that they don't become less woke.
They realize that beauty is the opposite of woke, and they fight back against the Trudeau protectorate.
Maybe a good way. Like it might be. Yeah, I mean, like he could submit like a dog returning to his vomit and a sow returning to his mire. But if he stands up, what if he stands up to them and it works? Like he's like, no, I'm not going, and it like shakes the world. Like they get rid of the carbon tax. You know, everyone sees Trudeau as a narcissist, and you know, like he breaks the pattern. He's not like a burnt fool's wobbling bandaged hand returning to the fire.
Yeah, he doesn't repeat his mistake from before, where he gave into the temptation of utopian wokeness, and this time he does not give into the temptation, and it spurs the revolution.
Yeah, I think that's most inspiring. It's got crossover appeal. There's what do they call it in filmmaking? The 4 quadrants.
4 quadrant ending to
yeah. That's beautiful. Okay, well, that's all the time we have this week, folks. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening.
What do you think should happen at the end? Sound off in the comments.
We're open to any and all fan fiction ending this sketch. And yeah, like the dog returns to its vomit, the sow returns to its mire, and the burnt fool's bandaged finger goes wobbling back to the fire, we're leaving you on the same cliffhanger ending for the second episode in a row. We still don't know how to end this one.
We can't help ourselves. It's just like a dog and its vomit.
As Kipling would write.
As Kipling would write, yeah. Well, that's all we got for this week, folks. That's our summary and discussion on the different elements of both this recent interview and then also some choice
tidbits
of past Pierre. And yeah, let us know what you think. Sound off in the comments as usual.
Yeah, do you have any plan for how to prevent Pierre from becoming prime minister? We would love to hear it if you know how to.
Should we let it rip on accelerationist grounds? Is letting Jagmeet stay in as leader? Is the person who's going to replace Jagmeet as leader going to be worse? Will they pivot to the right? Should we hold desperately on to Jagmeet?
Yeah, it's like a real possibility, yeah.
And are you someone who has no interest at all in Canadian politics and desperately hopes we don't do another episode about this in the next 6 months? Let us know in the comments on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Patreon, Discord, and via email, Messenger Pigeon. It's like a piss engine.
No. Messenger piss engine.
Whatever means you have. We love to read the comments, and we'll hear from you soon, talk to you soon, and have another episode for you soon.
Please do head on over to our Patreon. Support independent media who, as Pierre says,
I find the independent media gives me a fair shake.
And we do try to do that. I think we did. We achieved that.
We gave him a fair shake.
Yeah, quite the fair
little
shake.
Generous to him, but I think fair. And
yeah, if you want to support us giving a fair shake to him and to others, patreon.com/seriouslywrong. There's bonus episodes there, a whole archive of our content. You can get into our Discord server where there is a book club, and you're supporting the show. You're supporting independent media. We couldn't do it without you, and we thank you so very much to the people who are already doing it.
And we've got a 3-part series talking about Jordan Peterson's first book, where we pick it apart with a fair-minded, independent media style analysis. And everyone who listened to it said, "Wow, this is so wonderful, boys. Thank you so much for making it." And we said to them, "Well, you're welcome. Thank you so much for donating to the show." And you could join us in that conversation by signing up today.
And we'll see you next time.